All right, welcome to part two of the Expansionist Forum. We had some really fantastic feedback, so thank you for everyone that took the time to give us that feedback from our last episode. As always, we've got Stu on the line, but we've also got Fonzie back due to popular demand. Fonzie, how you going, my friend?
I'm very well, gents. I'm very well. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good. It's just obviously leading up to Christmas. I was just saying to Stu, it's that weird vibe where you can't quite relax because you got shit due, and it seems like the rest of the world around you is all already on holiday. So hopefully, I got to the end of next week to survive. I think we're going all right. But
And there's no footy on, so there's no excuse not to get your work done now and save your time and money for when the footy season rolls around next year.
cricket's good, Australia versus India, but it's Jesus, not the NRL, is it?
It's just not.
No, Fonzie, how are you keeping, my friend? It's been a couple of weeks.
Yeah, and I've been very well. Did a podcast for This Warriors Life last week. Sort of kept me in the game a little bit, and sort of looking forward to getting into the second half of our chat this week because I thought it was it's a pretty broad conversation last time, but I thought we covered some good ground and it was good bouncing off the both of you.
Me too. Stu, you keeping well?
I'm keeping well, training the house down pre-season, post-season, ready for a big year next year. But looking forward to our chat on international rugby league, one of my favourite subjects.
Definitely. I think all three of us can agree upon that. So it's no time like the present. Let's get straight stuck into it. First question is, it's pretty evident that the NRL now practically run the International Rugby League. Fonzie, starting with you, do you think this is a good thing or a bad thing?
Well, I mean, look, in an ideal world, you'd have an independent rugby league body making decisions in the interests of the international game with the resources to do that, right? But we don't live in an ideal world. So the reality is, if it's not the NRL, who's it going to be? Is it going to be the RFL? No, they can't even look after themselves, right? Is it going to be the New Zealand Rugby League? Again, different circumstances, different reasons, but they're not in a position to make a contribution to international rugby league. So really, it has to be the NRL. Now, whether the NRL do that directly, which is kind of what they're doing, they're directly organising events and things, or whether they fund the IRL, at the end of the day, if the money and the players are coming primarily from the NRL, they're going to control what happens. And that's just the reality of the structure of World Rugby League at the moment, I think. So in a way, I think it's good because the alternative would be nothing would happen, because without the NRL's blessing, there can be no top-tier international rugby league. And so if the NRL instead decides to step up and do something, then at least we get something. That's probably my take on it.
Yeah, I used to really despise the thought of this from happening. I used to sort of have this idealistic but unrealistic idea that NRL clubs should be jumping at releasing players for international rugby league games, that, IRL should be above the NRL and the RFL in the pecking order. And the reality is that, I've been following international rugby league very closely for around about 20 years now. That's just not going to happen. So I think when you said that the alternative is to have no one running it, I think that probably hits the nail on the head. Stu, what are your thoughts on this question, the NRL
Yeah,
running international?
look, I'm along the same lines. Philosophically, I think it's a bad thing having one governing body from one country who, in fact, govern a domestic competition. They should not be running a world organisation. However, in practical terms, they're the only organisation with the finances and resources to make a difference, unfortunately. Concern for me is the international game will be more at the mercy of NRL clubs, if that's possible. We've seen some good things with the Australian government-funded Pacific Champs run by the NRL, Samoa being supported to go to England, and the Kangaroos' decision to play in England to help the game there. So the NRL are doing some good things around international rugby league. Do I think it's ideal? No. Do I think it's a practical decision? Probably yes.
Let me ask you guys a question that's not on the run sheet, one that I wish I put on it, but I'm going to ask it anyway. New Zealand Rugby League, is it a good thing that they still exist? Should they be absorbed by the NRL? What do you think the dynamic should be like? Because, we've seen that last year's Pacific Championship final didn't look good. They were the ones that promoted it. The NRL have the resources. The New Zealand Rugby League don't. Fonzie, you've had some strong opinions on the NZRL in the past. Have they changed at all?
Yeah, this is a great question. right? And it's a really hard question. So the reality is, based on the financial resources the New Zealand Rugby League have, they are really just flat out doing the bare minimum in terms of development and the national team. Like, I think their annual revenue is something in the order of $5 to $7 million a year, right? You can barely buy 2 apartments in Auckland with that money, right? So they're not a body who has the capability to do development across all of New Zealand or to run a meaningful international program beyond hosting very limited number of Kiwi tests. So the New Zealand Rugby League is probably not a body who can, on its own, advance the game there. Now, should they exist? I think they should exist, but I do think we have to start looking at them more like we look at the QRL or the NSWRL, which is they should get a significant grant from the NRL in the same way the New South Wales and Queensland Rugby Leagues do. They get grants into tens of millions, which would triple New Zealand Rugby League's operating budget. And that money then could be funded through NRL approved development programs in New Zealand. I think that's the right model for New Zealand. The challenges with that is the Australians don't want to give up any of their money to New Zealand, and that's what it would be, to come straight out of the Australian pockets and into New Zealand. And secondly, it's not in the ARLC charter to run development in New Zealand because the ARLC's constitution is limited to Australia. So they probably need to change their constitution. And picking up from the conversation we had last week where I kept hammering this theme of, we need to think in terms of the Pacific sport. I think the same, what I just said about New Zealand also probably applies to Pacific nations, where the NRL's charter needs, or the ARLC's charter needs, to broaden to cover the whole Pacific. And we need to adopt that kind of regional funding model to enable development to apply consistently across the Pacific and not just in the 2 dominant states.
Do you agree with that, Stu? A complete takeover of New Zealand Rugby League and Rugby League in New Zealand by the NRL?
Complete takeover. I agree with a lot of what Fonzie said there. Complete takeover, I'm not sure. New Zealand Rugby League has to exist for 2 reasons, because, there is a national team, but, probably more importantly, they should be the ones that develop the domestic rugby league in New Zealand. They should know their market, and they should be the ones that actually do that. Whether they need separate funding is another story. I mean, when we look at, things like, World Cups and the possibility of New Zealand doing it, we realise that they're not at that level where they can do that sort of stuff, or put on an international program. We go back to whether the NRL's job or even the ARLC's job either, but given where international rugby league body is at, the NRL's the strongest. But I think they should exist, but I do see what Fonzie's point about, whether they should be in the same sort of position as the New South Wales Rugby League or the Queensland Rugby League, as far as where their place on the hierarchy is.
Yeah, I think, there's part of me that wants to say, if there's an NRL team in that country, the NRL should be running it, just due to the reality of the money that the ARLC has. So last episode we spoke about the fact that the New Zealand TV deal generates $34 million per annum. Okay, so the Australian clubs don't want to fund the growth of the game in New Zealand, but they also don't want to give up that $34 million per annum. It seems a little sort of greedy to me, in fact. Yeah. They just want to take without giving anything back in that regard, which I think has basically been what happened. The Warriors have never really been strongly associated with the New Zealand Rugby League, been an entity of the NRL or private entity of that, under that ownership structure. The complication to my thought comes where PNG come into the competition. Does the ARLC also fund PNG Rugby League in the same way they're funding the NRL? Have any of you guys got any thoughts on that one?
Well, in effect, they are. It's just the money's coming from the government. So, when we talk about the ARLC funding, remember the ARLC isn't a bank. It just takes money from media broadcasters or gate takings at rep games or whole of game sponsors and redirects it to the clubs, right? That's all it does, and redirects it to the New South Wales Rugby League and the Queensland Rugby League. In the case of Papua New Guinea, it's going to receive money from the government and redirect it to the PNG team and related infrastructure. So the ARLC isn't, we all know this, but it's worth sort of repeating because the PNG changes your mental model a bit, but it's just a clearinghouse, right? It sells certain rights on a group basis for all of the clubs, and then it's just the clearinghouse for redistributing that money back to the clubs. So should the ARLC fund high performance development in Papua New Guinea? Well, it's going to. And it's done a deal with the government to do that. So in effect, yes, that's exactly what's going to happen.
Mm. And I'm not opposed to that whatsoever. Let me ask you. Sorry, I'm throwing some questions at you guys that weren't actually on the run sheet here, but I've just thought of one because it was Tony Mestrov's comment in the buy round sort of roundtable edition that they recently had. He said that after the 10 years worth of Australian government funding for the PNG team expires, PNG can't really be trusted to run themselves because of the corruption in that country. Now, Fonzie, you have probably a further or deeper insight into PNG. You've been there. I don't know many other people that have been there, and also your knowledge around some of the more nuanced areas of the country. Do you think that the corruption in PNG is a huge threat to the long-term survival of an NRL club there?
I think it's an issue. I think there are problems with corruption in PNG. No one's going to argue about that. You're going to have your governance right. But I think, again, if you put the right protocols, the right governance structures and so on, you can follow the money. Like, for example, it might be that the NRL has to pay players directly, right, so that the money doesn't come through. It might be that the NRL funds travel costs directly. It might be that certain third-party costs that are associated with the club come directly from the NRL if we find governance issues in the way that club is run, because that way there's not just a big bucket of money going over there and then getting sloshed around into different directions. So I suppose what I'm saying is it an issue? Yes. Is it solvable? I think so. And so I don't see that as a reason why the club would fail if other things are going well for it.
Yeah, good answer. Stu, you're obviously a rugby league journalist and a fantastic one at that, if I may say so. We obviously acknowledge the practicality of or the reality that the NRL is running international rugby league for all intents and purposes now. Have you any insight into where you think their plans lie for the international game?
Look, my first point when I go to the NRL is they're not a charity, and anything they do has to benefit the NRL. Otherwise, they're not going to do it. So my guess is they'll want to have power and influence where it helps the NRL. So we're looking particularly at the Pacific region. But look, they're not going to want to have overall governance of the game globally. I mean, there's a lot of stuff that International Rugby League does that, the NRL's not going to be interested in that. Where's the benefit for them? The nitty-gritty stuff. So, for instance, I like what the NRL are doing with Las Vegas, but to me, there's no suggestion that it's going to grow the game in the USA. It's really about attracting interest and revenue to the NRL. And look, whether they look at, the Pacific to the NRL, and let's be clear, Fonzie mentioned before, the work they're doing in the Pacific is based on money being given to them by the Australian government. It's not the NRL saying, "Oh, let's put in our budget to throw these millions into the Pacific because we're just good guys and we want to develop the game there." That's not true at all. So anything they do is going to be there to benefit them, but they're also going to have some expertise and resources that can be very useful to International Rugby League.
Building on what we discussed, and Fonzie, you had some phenomenal insight into towards the end of the last episode around the Super League needing to be essentially gutted because it's on its knees right now and it just needs, it's on life support already. Is there any does the NRL need to step in and save the game in England? Should it treat England like it's almost treating the Pacific, but how can it do that if there's no funding from the Australian government? Have you got any thoughts on that area?
Well, I mean, I think I sort of said last week, I'd burn the thing down and start again if I was in the UK in terms of the professional game. So should the NRL step in and do that? Well, firstly, I mean, I'm not sure they can between their own constitution and the fact the RFL runs the game there. There's a whole series of landmines around that you'd end up with like a Super League war again and that kind of thing. So there's that sort of issue about is it even possible? But, to Stu's point just now, what's in it for them? Like, what's in it for the Australian clubs to want to divert resources to do that? I'm not sure there is anything in it for them, with a possible exception, like I mentioned last week. Maybe you could stand up a London team, use it to cross-sell to the expat community, use it as a marketing vehicle, and it's only relatively low cost. Maybe there's a couple of plays like that you could make that would stand up. But overall, yeah, I don't presently see why the NRL can or would want to do that.
It's a scary thought to think that there'd only be one professional rugby league competition in the world, which sort of, isn't that different to the AFL really, despite the fact that our game is played in a wider amount of places. So I think that we need to do everything as a game without being too philanthropic in terms of ensuring that there's always at least two completely separate professional rugby league competitions. But I'll move on from that question, but I'll stick with you, Fonz. The Men's World Cup was recently reduced to 10 teams. A lot of people have some strong opinions around this. What are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, well, I mean, it was reduced to 10 teams because basically 2 tournaments in a row just really struggled to stack up financially. One actual and one mooted tournament, right? So the French basically were only going to host a tournament of the size it was going to be because of enormous government funding that fell through as belts got tightened. I think that was the experience in the UK on the previous tournament as well, where the larger format didn't quite hit financial targets. So again, yeah, it's a great idea to have the biggest World Cup you can possibly have with the most participants and all the rest of it, but who's going to pay for it? And so once you introduce commercial reality, then you start having to look at it and say, right, if we want the tournaments to stack up financially so they're not at the risk and whim of government, then we need to bring them back to a sort of defensible core, right? And that probably is about 10 teams at the moment, where those 10 teams are going to 10 or so teams, going to get your costs right down. It's going to maximize the number of competitive games you've got that you can sell to both crowds and broadcasters. Your staging costs are lower. And again, to me, it's probably a sensible reality of where we are. And, there's a lot of claims on the money, on the game's money, and there's not a lot of money in the game, so we have to decide where it's going to go. So do we want it to go to turning Papua New Guinea, for example, or, into a top flight side, or do we want to develop New Zealand, or do we want to every 4 years have nations 11 to 20 participating in a World Cup? Like what is the comparative priority of those things? And I don't mind that they pared it back to 10. I think it makes it a better tournament to watch for the casual fan, and it gives us a better opportunity to turn it into a profit-making part of the game, which then ensures it continues and doesn't get killed by clubs and others.
Great answer. Stu, your thoughts on 10-team Men's World Cup?
Yeah, along similar lines in some ways. It depends. It depends what you see as the aim of a World Cup. Danny Zangian explained on this podcast that the RRL have taken a commercial view, as Fonzie explains, by playing a World Cup in Australia with a reduced number of teams. And the hope there is to make it as much revenue as possible. If we look at the other code, which we occasionally talk about, obviously a different kettle of fish, but they've actually increasing the number of teams they're having at a World Cup from 20 to 24. So teams like Georgia, Portugal, and Japan have taken some large thrustings over the years, but a team like Japan has emerged as a strong nation through persistence and patience, I suppose. It's the same approach with Italy and the Six Nations when they were suffering big losses. And I was at the last World Cup, obviously, with Greece, and some said Jamaica and Greece shouldn't have been at the last World Cup given the scores, but countries do need something to aspire to, which does help development. So I can see the commercial reasons for it and understand it, but for long-term growth in a number of countries, I'm hoping that, we can expand out.
Yeah, I think my thoughts on this, and this is what the IRL have absolutely sucked at in the past, which is getting their message out there and explaining the decisions. Mm-hmm. Now, that's why I was so really happy when Danny Kazandijan, who's the secretary of the IRL, agreed to come on the show, and he gave us a lot of his time, more than an hour, in fact. So I encourage anyone to just listen to go back and listen to that episode, because he explains the logic really well. And it's the fact that we go England, Australia, England, Australia, England, Australia. Basically, that's the way the World Cup hosting has worked. And we need to break that cycle But the feedback that they've gotten is that they can't break that cycle because it costs too much money to host a World Cup, particularly a World Cup with 14 men's team, 10 women's team, 8 wheelchair team. What rugby league, what country can afford to bid on that, or would be willing to bid on that for a sport like rugby league? We're just confining ourselves to too few countries, and it basically would have ensured the continuation of the England-Australia cycle, with England getting weaker over time. Now, what he did say is that splitting the World Cups into, standalone wheelchair, standalone women, standalone men's has ensured countries like Kenya and South Africa to actually put forward pretty competitive bids, which aren't sort of countries that most fans would be associating rugby league with. But if it ensures that we now have, 6 or 8 genuine bids that can fund a 10-team men's World Cup that will make money for the IRL to finance the game afterwards, then that's probably a good way of looking at it, as opposed to just wanting to see what France were going to put on offer. Because the French one would have been amazing, don't get me wrong, but they had close to 50 million euros and it still fell over. That's how expensive it is to host 3 World Cups. And after France, there's not many other countries willing to do that. So I think that's the silver lining in all this, is that it's going to open up countries. It's going to move the World Cup out of that cycle that we see it in. We've got PNG in Australia coming up, and then who knows where the next one after that is going to be. I still hold hope that France can come back and hold it a little bit later on. Any further thoughts on that, guys, or we're good to move on to the next question?
I was just going to say, you mentioned it. South Africa is a really interesting one because obviously they've already got the infrastructure there, being such a huge rugby union country, and possibly a potential audience, but also probably the resources to get a World Cup done. And they're a country that, outside of Australia / New Zealand, because I don't think New Zealand can do it its own, and England, that they might be the other possibility.
Yeah, I mean, my other thought on that is, we complain about 10. The reality is I reckon we've only got 3 markets that are going to pay real money for our World Cup, right? So in a way, the other 7 nations are already getting subsidised by the money coming out of Australia, New Zealand and England. Like, we've already got, I reckon, 3 profitable nations in the World Cup and the other 7 being subsidised. Union might have 16 or 20 teams, but I reckon they've got 10 plus nations paying serious money for TV broadcasting rights. So we're, even at 10, we're probably subsidising more nations than the Union World Cup is, just because they have so many more markets to sell to. That's just the reality of it.
Yeah, I agree. The last thing I would have to say to this one is, I remember being the nerd that I am, looking at the finances from the 2008 World Cup, which was actually, this is probably the perfect example if you go back even further. The 2000 World Cup was such an incredible financial disaster that it set the game back to being able to hold another World Cup 4 years later. They had to have a break in the cycle. And the next World Cup after the year 2000 came in 2008. And it's exactly what the amount of teams that we were just talking about. It was 10 teams and it was hosted by Australia. So the mirroring of what happened in the past is quite poetic here. We had the UK hosting a large tournament that I think had teams like Cook Islands and Lebanon maybe debut. I could be wrong there, Stu. But it was an absolute financial disaster. And then we had to extend the amount of time before we held the next World Cup, which we're doing right now, from 4 years to 5 years. Back then it was from 4 years to 8 years. And then Australia steps in, reduces the amount of teams in the World Cup to ensure financial viability, and then hosts a successful World Cup in Australia. And then we start again trying to build up. That World Cup made $5 billion. I think the goal for the next World Cup, which is in 2013, with the idea to get it out of an Olympic and Rugby World Cup cycle, was to double the profit. So we made 5,000 Australian dollars 2008 World Cup 10 teams. We wanted to make 10 million Australian dollars after that. I don't think it achieved that. And then we got too ambitious, and then we fell back down again to where we are now. So if it prevents that from happening again, then I'm certainly all for it. All right. Well, this one's for you to start with, Fonz. What countries do you think it makes most sense for the IRL to focus their limited resources on?
Well, maybe you can tell me first, Keith, what resources do you think the IRL have? I mean, what are we talking here? Are we talking $500,000 grant and 3 dev offices? Is that the scale? It's a serious question. Like, is that the scale of the IRL's resources at this point?
To be honest with you, I think the IRL's resources are softer than that in terms of they've got decent relationships with governments. They've got very, very limited resources. Stu, you work for Greek Rugby League. I
Yep.
might handball this one to you.
Yeah.
Greece don't get any grants from the IRL, do they? They rely solely on sponsorship.
No,
So
and
members do get a
yeah,
small amount, right?
yeah. Unless you're a full member, that's the only way you can actually you do get a grant. If you're hosting a World Cup qualifier or something like that, you might get a bit of help with that. But generally, the help will be more in, someone will come and help train your referees or coaches and officials and things like that. The IRL and ERL, the word is that I've heard, are in the most dire financial situation that they've ever been. I believe the IRL paid out some of the ERL's debts, but they also got rid of a gentleman that was on our podcast, Jovan, who was probably one of the most passionate and hardworking people at the ARL. They are in serious, serious financial problems. So 500,000. I wouldn't even be talking about that. They're struggling to keep their head above water and pay the few people they've got on the payroll at the moment.
Yeah, they do get a grant from the European Union. I don't think it's $500,000, but it is material, relatively speaking, to the small size of the IRL. They do give members a small amount of money. Let's say they gave them $20,000 per year, which maybe not, because the finances are so murky. But let's hypothetically say that. I know Australia always foregoes that grant.
That's your full members. So France, Serbia, I think still a full member. Italy got kicked out, so I don't think there's many in Europe. So if you're talking Europe, that's probably the only people that actually get funding now.
Yeah, there's just no money there. But so I guess it adds a bit of a hypothetical component to this question, Fonz. Where does it make most sense for the IRL to focus on, at least, not just more monetarily, but just in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot happening in the Pacific off the back of the NRL and Australian and regional governments. So they're not going to turn the dial down here, I don't think. So we're looking in the northern hemisphere, where I obviously know a lot less, or it's a lot less visible to me. And Stu, you'll know better than I would. But I always thought if there was a strategic approach, you'd look at France, and you'd look at trying to get them up. As the English game goes down, the silver lining is if you can build France up, they'll hit parity pretty soon. And I always thought from the Catalan region, there's an easy way to get a little beachhead into the north of Spain and potentially get Spain as, like, if you could, get a region of 500,000 people in the north of Spain playing the game through that link into the south of France, then that makes Spain another nation. It's a good tourist destination. And, they've taken the odd game to Barcelona, and there's been a little bit of noise there. So I always sort of thought that developing France, lifting them up a bit, maybe using that springboard into the north of Spain might be a go. Then I hear different things about where Serbia's at, and that's always felt like a place where a little bit of money might go a long way, because there's some kind of organic growth there, but I'm just not sure how big it is. So that's probably be my answer, mate. But I'm probably just not enough. Like, I don't know as much about what's going on the ground in the northern hemisphere to answer that question really well.
Yeah, fair enough. For me, I think I initially thought Ireland, to tell the truth, but the big thing for me is populations and some kind of rugby league presence, however small it might be. And we'll come to sort of like the Samoa Tonga question a little bit later, but I guess they're sort of solely reliant on a diaspora. I mean, no one's coming out of the APIA-based competition and representing Samoa at a high level. So Fiji has 1 million people, so it makes sense to focus on Fiji. PNG has, we sort of landed on that figure of 11 million, but it's hard to tell. Minimum 11 million, let's say. And they all love rugby league. So obviously that's a great sort of place to focus any limited resources on. England needs saving, so we need to focus some resources on there, but it's not cheap. The pound is the strongest currency in the world in terms of the conversion rate. France is obviously, the big one. I think we all agree that, if there's one country, it has to be France if we could get it up and running. But it's a big population. I think they're above 60 million. It must be third or so in the in Europe in terms of population. So we need to be realistic. Fiji is a perfect example. There's 1 million people. They already know rugby league. There's plenty of players coming out of there. It might make sense to sort of start slow before we start to sort of, bite off more than we can chew. But Stu, have you got any thoughts on where the game should be focusing their very, very limited resources?
Yeah. Again, to me, it's a question of what do you want to do? Do you want to grow the game and have participation in lots of countries? So if you go to a country and you know that rugby league's played there, or do you want to consolidate the countries that are there? So if it's about consolidation, it's probably, we've got the big three as we've discussed, the Polynesian nations, PNG and France. Perhaps an easy win possibly could be in the home countries of Scotland, Ireland, Wales, because obviously they know the game, understand game, have a big rugby union culture. You might be able to have some wins there if you're prepared to put some resources in there. I talked about IRL and ERL, and going back to Jovan going, that really puts the game in Europe on shaky ground. I mean, it was already shaky ground, but in these European countries, you're talking about one or two people doing a lot of hard work to try and get things going. If you don't have someone else supporting them in the ERL, it just gets harder and harder. When it comes to rugby league, I know we talked about the commercial realities of professional competitions, but I'm a bit of a, I call myself a bit of a rugby league socialist. So I want to see the game spread and played everywhere, equally. So have either of you have been to Iceland?
No. Reykjavik is a very flat city, though, perfect for drone delivery.
Yeah, and there's a club there called the Reykjavik Raiders. They played 2 matches this year against Norway and Sweden. So how good would it be to go to Iceland and not only see the delights of Iceland, but also see a rugby league game there? Asia's another one that we've talked about. We particularly talked about that with Dane Campbell. We've got Hong Kong, the Philippines. Again, you're talking about 1 or 2 people just doing all the hard work. In Japan, Dane Campbell's beginning in Singapore, but I don't see the ARL doing anything around that. I mean, you're lucky to get a media release, to be honest, telling people about it. Things are moving in Africa, we keep getting told, but how does that go to the next level? What could the ARL do to help them go to the next level? So, yeah, look, I probably haven't answered that question fully because I don't think there's one answer to all that.
Yeah, no, it's fair enough. And the more I think about it, the more I come back to what Fonzie was saying. The IRL, I know we said this in the context of the NRL, but the IRL too are somewhat facilitators of exporting, let's say, framework to run a good rugby league setup, both sort of in practical purposes in terms of training and refereeing, but also from a financial standpoint, what sort of regulations over the trust account and all that kind of stuff. What kind of audit trail do they have? Is it an annual audit? If they don't lodge an annual audit, then what are the repercussions of that? And who is the professional body that's actually speaking to these governments around the world? Who are the real ones, I should say, that are usually giving some kind of grant to keep the sport running in those countries. So the IRL itself is not the ones giving the money. They're the ones talking to national governments and getting it under sport or fitness grants. So that's probably something that they do add value. But if the resources continue to decrease, like we just spoke about with Jovan, then who's going to talk to the governments around the world?
Exactly.
Which is a big concern. Our next question, though, I'll sort of stick with you, Stu. What do you think the future of Tonga and Samoa is?
Internationally, I can only see them getting stronger. And there's an increasing number. I think it's 53% now of Polynesians playing in the NRL. So, their international teams are just going to get stronger. My concern probably more is domestically. They're competing with World Rugby, who are not going to give up those islands without a fight. So I'd like to hear more about domestic competitions and junior development and hopefully more resources from the NRL/Australian government into growing the game there, because I think it's a big fight and I think it's a fight that they can win, but it's going to take a lot of work.
Fonzie?
Yeah, I mean, I think we need to accept that the main purpose of Tonga and Samoa from a commercial point of view is to provide players and to provide opposition for Australia and New Zealand. And, because that they do not, on the islands, the commercial means to stand up professional comps themselves or to even, I think, host major games very profitably. So that's their role in the game. Now, I'm not trying to take away any of their pride in representing their country. They can win World Cups, those two nations. I can see either of those nations winning a World Cup in the next 10 years, right? Because they are out and out, pound for pound, the best players on the planet. No two ways about it. But commercially, that's where they sit, and that's likely where they will always sit. And so that's where the future for them is, and the strategy for them has to be. So Tonga and Samoa should be lobbying for more test matches against Australia and New Zealand, and they should be lobbying for equal pay in those tests. And as we said I said last week or the other week, we should equalise pay across those games and Origin, right? So that the players who play for Tonga and Samoa playing out of passion and selecting, based on their heritage and who they want to play for. And, I think they're going to perform the most important role in international rugby league in the next decade, which is offering credible opposition for the markets that can sustain internationals. I think that's what they're going to do.
Just to interject, I think I could be wrong here, but I think there is parity now after the latest collective bargaining agreement, not between Origin and international, but there's a $5,000 payment that everyone gets paid for,
including kangaroos.
I'm pretty sure. Kangaroos, Tonga, Samoa, New Zealand, all 5,000. There's something like that in the CBA. Any listeners out there, don't come at me if I'm wrong, but that's what
actually pays that. Steve?
I think it's the NRL. I mean, the NRL is organised.
Surely that's the only organisation that could pay that.
Yeah. I don't think English players are on the same thing. We saw that in Toulouse, I think it was, where they got paid like $800 or something like that to play France during the year.
But also, I wouldn't dismiss the player talent still on the islands. I think that if you, like I think I said the other week, the Penrith LGA has, I think, 250,000 people. I think Samoa's got a few 100,000 itself, right? And I think if you set up, like the Roosters have just set up a high performance centre in the South Island of New Zealand, I think there's value in setting up a high performance centre in some island nations. Maybe it's Fiji, but I think Samoa could be one. Tonga could be one too, where for a few $1 million, I think you could generate a player pathway coming out of there that would be good for the game as a whole. So I think we shouldn't write that off, even though the populations are small. Put it this way, you put a high performance pathway in Tonga, population 100,000, and you put one in Adelaide, population 1 million, and I know which team in 10 years is going to be better. It's the one coming out of Tonga. That's the truth of it.
And I think this is where we get in the battle with rugby union too. If we can put those things in place, then it's going to be more attractive for players on the island to play rugby league rather than rugby union. And because traditionally that's where they've gone, to rugby union.
Yeah, I agree with everything just said. Next question, I'll start with you in terms of the answer, Fonz, if that's all right. There's talk of the NRL season being shortened to basically only play each other once, with maybe a couple of derbies in there. Let's say the figure being thrown around is around 20 rounds. Do you think that could potentially prove to be the dawn of international rugby league?
Well, yeah, this gets tossed around a bit. It depends what we use the time for, doesn't it? So the RLPA is probably going to want to use the time for an extended break for players, or for an extended preseason to manage player fatigue and workload. I think I'm not convinced we are going to get to that shorter season, because I don't know why we'd leave broadcast revenue on the table for that. Like I would oppose that. I don't want to go to that shorter season. I think the NRL should be played for a month longer than that, because the amount of money you make from that extra month is going to fund a whole heap of other things where, we keep talking about we don't have money to do A, B, and C. It's no good having the time if you don't have the money, right? So if we can get a significantly higher TV deal playing 24 rounds, let's do it. We can play enough internationals on a 24-round comp. We currently got a 26, 27-round comp, including buys for Origin, and then a bit of a half-hearted postseason calendar. We could work off 24. So my personal view is we should aim for a 24-week calendar, maximise the earning the game makes from its flagship product, which is the NRL. And I think we still have time to play internationals and rep games And if we have to cut the off season back for a few weeks, so be it. Like I'd rather cut it there. I mean, players go back in November. They do 6 weeks or something up to Christmas, and they go off and spend 2 weeks having beers and eating, turkey and all the rest of it, and they come back and smash back into fitness. Like, do they need that pre-Christmas stint? Like, really? And if they do, like, does it need to be 6 weeks? Could it be 4 weeks? Could it just be a pure fitness block? So, to me, I don't think we need to shorten the NRL season to make internationals happen. I think that's a bit of a false dichotomy. And I think the RLPA, let's just say, I think they're very vocal around some of this stuff, but it doesn't offend me, the idea that there'd be a 24-round NRL season. I mean, it's not crazy. It's always been like that.
Yeah, I think sort of we can't fuck this one up as a game, because when are we going to be able to add 2 extra games per round in a relatively short period, thus expanding the amount of games per year in relatively speaking, one hit? I can't see that maybe even ever happening again, really. So, for example, if we did go to 20 rounds, that's still, I could get my maths on. I remember trying to calculate it a few weeks ago. I think that's still 3 more games than we currently have with the 27 round competition with 17 teams in it. Yeah,
it's about the same number of total games. Yeah, but I think people think from that means you'd get the same money from broadcasters. You would if it was ad revenue funded, maybe, but not when it's subscription funded. So if people can turn off KO 7 weeks earlier, right, because the NRL season's over after 20 instead of 27 weeks, KO's not paying you the same money, even though the same number of games are on in that 20-week block, based on their monthly subscription model. So yes, the number of games is probably the biggest driver of your TV deal, but the duration of your season also significantly impacts revenue from subscription services.
Yeah, great point. It's how often you're in the public psyche, I guess. That's something that's cricket has sort of struggled with over the years. I mean, how many quality weeks is cricket the number one sport here in the country? And they're either playing overseas, or when they are playing against teams like India, which we currently see a 5-test, I think it's the first 5-test series against India in 20 years or something like that. So that's something that cricket haven't gotten right. But that's possibly because there's such an international game and Australia's overseas so often. We don't have that luxury, for lack of better wording of it. But Stu, what are your thoughts on the effect of a shortened NRL season on international rugby league?
Yeah, look, I think if we went to, say, 20 rounds, as Fonzie said, you'd still hear talk of player physical and mental fatigue. State of origin is not going to go away, so origin's going to be there. As far as international rugby league goes, I'm not convinced that the NRL will even make it a priority then. We hear sort of, down the pipe, mainly from the International Rugby League, that Blandis and Abdo are advocates for international rugby league, but I haven't really seen that demonstrated. Yes, we run a Pacific Champs competition at the end of the season because it's being funded by Australian government, and it's sort of pretty easy to run. But I still don't think that their priority is international rugby league, and there's a number of reasons for that, and revenue being one of them. And they can use the player fatigue side of things, even when there's 20 rounds, to be honest.
Yeah. And I suppose one other thing, like one of the other reasons people want 20 rounds is because they want an equal draw. So like everyone plays each other once, which should actually be 19. But I mean, you can solve to that. You can, for example, you could run a magic round in each of Sydney, Melbourne, Perth and Auckland, say, where you draw the opposition for that round out of a hat. Right. And so there's complete randomness of that. And so the draw's fair in the sense of being random. And, you could do that and there's your 24 hours. So there's different ways to solve the different reasons people want a shorter game. But I just think the Players Association overcooks that. And I think there's no reason we have to limit ourselves to 20 rounds when there's so much money value and enjoyment value from a 24-week season. I'd have the shits if my season ended in August, So.
Yeah. Me too. Me too. I get the shits when the Warriors have a bye. I'm aimless that weekend. Oh, my wife loves it. We've fucking watched Below Deck or some shit in its place, and I feel less intelligent, even though the NRL isn't known for being quite the astute sport that we'd like it to. I think it's a little bit better than Below Deck Med. and shit that she makes me watch.
I
Don't worry,
sometimes,
she doesn't listen.
I sometimes feel a sense of relief when the West Tigers have got a bye. The anxiety levels and the blood pressure is going to be a little bit more stable. But anyway, that's another.
All right. We've only got a few more questions. We obviously just spoke about, we're trying to pontificate on what effect a shorter NRL season will have on international rugby league. What effect do you guys think? I'll start with you, Stu, this time. What effect do you think it would have on the Super League if the NRL went from 27 rounds down to 20 rounds? We're already superior competition in terms of what we can offer.
Yeah.
We spoke about sort of the salary cap, etc. Will this further distance the two competitions? What effect do you think it will have?
Possibly. I actually can't see a lot of change. I know the Super League seem to have a very long season, and I don't know how many rounds it actually goes to off the top of my head, but they do seem to have a very long season. The only thing I can see is they may follow, as they've done in the past with some NRL initiatives, and actually reduce their season a bit as well. That's the only thing that I can actually see that would change things up for them, to be honest.
But they can't afford to. That's the problem with the Super League. They want, I think everyone wants to get rid of the loop fixtures in the Super League, but they rely on gate taking so heavily that taking away 2 or 3 games worth of gate takings will see half of them collapse potentially. Do you think that this? Yeah, I was going to say, could this be the accelerating the death knell of the Super League? Like, I don't know. Like, any thoughts?
If it comes to Catalans, they'd love to get rid of that game because they reckon they don't bring any supporters anyway. So and it goes outside the little radius of vision. So they'd probably be happy if they didn't have a Catalans home game. But yeah, look, yeah, I mean, I think the comment on that is it's if you're relying on gate takings, then it's not a Super League.
Yeah, Fonz, any thoughts on this one?
I don't think it'd make a difference, mate. The two competitions are miles apart. It's getting wider as it is. If we went to 20 or 24 or 27, it wouldn't make a difference there. They play more than 30 games, I think, when you throw a Challenge Cup and this and that. It's a very, very long season. And you're right, they can't shorten it because they need money, which is back to, you just got to burn it down because there's no way out of that knot for them. I think they got bigger problems than us going to 20 rounds.
Yeah, fair call. I'm going to sort of make these 2 final questions pretty brief because we've already covered the lion's share of the answer. But Stu, what are your thoughts on the game in the Northern Hemisphere?
Well, if by Northern Hemisphere we're saying England and France, I think at the moment, as we've discussed a number of times together, it's contracting and becoming increasingly insular and focused on a small area in the north of England. I mean, if we're talking about the professional game, so teams from France and even London are treated as outsiders and almost like the enemy by administrators and some fans. I mean, it actually takes me back to the game when it was Sydney focused and was perceived as the only top rugby league. Recently, they asked for new teams to come into League One, the 3rd tier. They chose a team that's 10 kilometres from Hull and Gould, when there was a couple of other expansion clubs very interested in going. I just think a broad vision is needed, but obviously, as we've discussed, funding is the biggest issue there.
Yeah, I think I'd love to see, from a domestic point of view, not love, that's a terrible way of wording it. I think what we need to see, if it was an economic sort of paper, we could casually refer to these clubs as zombie firms. And we had sort of the case where, and then follow me here for a second, we had the COVID stimulus packages propping up zombie firms, which in a sort of usual macroeconomic environment or microeconomic environment would have seen these firms collapse and fall over. I think that we can't do that straight away, but the IMG strategy is 12 years long. I'm optimistically hoping that we see clubs that just simply can't afford to be in the Super League drop down to Championship or Championship 1, and clubs that are doing all the right things can be allowed to financially grow. I don't know whether it's going to happen or not, but from a broader point of view, I think we need to do everything we can to prop up France, which we've discussed. America's an interesting one. They sort of Canada, America, even Jamaica, throw it in there. I think USA beat South Africa on the weekend. I don't know what effect the Vegas sort of NRL venture is going to have on USA Rugby League, but I'd love to see, you're over there, you got this combine. Maybe if there's, one men and one women's player coming to play in the NRL structure every year, eventually you're going to get sort of 10 or 20 players there. Maybe that'll strengthen the USA team. I don't know, but I'm struggling to find real optimistic points to make about the Northern Hemisphere. So I'll end my answer on the fact that I think Australia is touring England when they absolutely are needed to tour the most, because that makes the BBC coverage. It makes even Channel 4. It is huge when it's the only cut through rugby league gets in the national media in England is when the English national side play. So when Australia tour on an Ashes tour, I think that's hopefully going to be a shot in the that the game needs. I just don't know what happens after that. Fonzie, any thoughts on the Northern Hemisphere?
Mate, not a lot. I mean, yeah, the Kangaroo Tour will be fine until we beat them 60-0 3 times, and then what?
I don't think we will.
I don't think so either. I think there's enough English players and more coming playing in the NRL for them to put up a reasonable team.
Yeah, well, that's like I said. I don't want that to happen because I love international footy, but my heart will be in my mouth when they run out because, if they turn up, the Australians will belt the Poms, and that last sort of cut through product might not have the same luster. But in terms of, yeah, I mean, we just got to be real about what it is, right? Like most of the Super League are running off semi-pro budgets. The player numbers in England, Wales, Scotland, and Ireland in Wales, Scotland, and Ireland, incredibly low.
Yeah.
France, Catalans are a bright spot to lose, but the game there is actually still in decline, I think, outside of those two. We just have to understand that and there's not much else in the Northern Hemisphere that is worth talking about as far as even semi-pro goes. Well, plenty of fantastic individuals do really great things at grassroots level across different areas, but they're not going to turn the dial in terms of, any kind of professional commercial product. I mean, really what all those people are doing is just waiting for somebody to stand up a pro comp in Europe, in some part of Europe, that gives players a pathway to somewhere that actually pays more than a bricklayer earns. That's what they're all hoping for. The best thing that can happen there is whether it's in England or some mix of England and France or something else. They, like I said, knock down what they got and get a genuine pro comp going somehow. And I don't have the answer to how. And just give players a reason to not play union. Because at the moment, the only way you can earn a quid out of rugby in the Northern Hemisphere is play union, full stop. That's it. It's just the truth of it.
Yeah, somber words, but reflecting reality, unfortunately. We'll go to something which I think will be a more positive answer, and I'll stick with you, Fonzie. What are your thoughts on the game in the Southern Hemisphere?
Yeah, so I mean, the game in the Southern Hemisphere is doing a lot better. We're in a growth phase. That's exciting. I think, and we've said a lot about that in this pod and the previous one, but the point I want to make that I haven't made is I don't forget how close the game came to being on its knees here through the late 90s post-Super League. This period of growth is relatively fresh. It's only about a decade old. We were in all sorts, and given what's happened in the Northern Hemisphere, we're kind of the last place with the light on, right, down here. And so if you sort of take that image of it's the last fire that's burning in a serious way, it's fragile. We got to be, we got to be a little bit careful with it. We do have a responsibility down here to keep rugby league as a pro sport, as a growing sport going. So, yeah, I mean, I think the game in the Southern Hemisphere is on the up, but it's on the up from I would say, a relatively low historical base. And we shouldn't get ahead of ourselves. And we should be very careful about what we do from here because we've got a big responsibility.
Yeah, well said. Stu, thoughts on the game in the Southern Hemisphere?
Yeah, so, as we've discussed, the game is thriving according to numbers and more eyes are on the game. Growth in the women's game has been phenomenal, and we're seeing the integration of league tag and touch into numbers, which I'm not sure what that really means. But my point probably here is we need to be careful not to ignore the grassroots community. And that in that I'm talking about the NRL and country areas. Is this is the platform that elite levels are built on. being in Canberra, I've got an association with, what I would call country clubs and been involved with them. And a lot of country clubs are struggling. And we talked about Polynesians, but also a lot of traditionally NRL players have come from that sort of country background. As I mentioned before, the New Zealand domestic competition should be developed further, particularly if we're going to have two NRL clubs there. And I saw the other day Graham Lowe and the Christchurch team saying they've vowed to be a development club, which they see as their differentiation from the Warriors, who they call not a development club, which I thought was interesting. But if they're going to be a development club, they need to put some money into infrastructure and competitions in New Zealand.
Yeah, can I just on that? I mean, so the Warriors, to their credit, just to speak in defence of my team, have turned a corner into being a development club, which is a good thing in the way they're integrating over there. So Lowy's a little bit off there, but I appreciate his sentiment to, want to be a development club as well. I agree with Stu about country areas in New South Wales and Queensland. I think that's completely valid. And again, it's back to this, there's so many areas that need money, need help. Where's the best place to do it? Is where do you get the most bang for your buck in terms of supporters, players, and all of those things? And, things like the NRL and Origin and so on, we should be absolutely trying to maximise the revenue we get out of those products so we can put it back into those places, so we can grow in Tonga and in, Yass and in, Coonabarabran and in all the areas where we need help, we need to subsidise. So, yeah, but I think we've got a platform to do it in the Southern Hemisphere now, and so I think there's good times ahead for us.
Yeah, I don't think I can think of anything else to add to that question. So I'll move to the sort of roundup here. Any broadly speaking final words from you, Fonz?
I don't know, but I think the thing I've taken away from kicking this around with you guys, I feel like the biggest trick we've got is that we sort of need to analyse this in terms of as though we're running a business, but footy's not a business, so you don't tend to make money from footy. And if you run a pure business case lens over everything you do in an area like sport, you tend not to do very much, or you might do the wrong things. So the reason this is so hard is that it really is a place where you've got to kind of have a mix of gut sentiment and commercial smarts. It's no good following sentiment and your gut into areas that burn all your cash and then you can't do anything at all. On the other hand, if you run a pure hardcore business case over every international fixture, you wouldn't play any, and eventually you'd find yourself shrinking like the north of England has into a narrow space, right? So it's a very tricky area, and I don't envy the decision of people like Volandis and others who have to make those judgment calls. And I just hope the governance constraints we have around the ARLC's constitution and those things don't limit their ability to follow their sentiment and be a bit bold on some of these things, and not just get into narrow business cases all the time.
Yeah, well put. Stu, any final words?
Yeah, it just keeps bringing up this question to me. Does rugby league want to be like the NFL, where there's just one very strong, powerful competition that we hope the world will watch with no international competition at all? Basically no, besides very, very small pockets, NFL's not really played anywhere else besides the USA. Is that what we want for the NRL Australia, or do we want a strong international competition that looks more like, aspiration-wise to rugby union? So, to me, it's the second option, but I think we're moving towards the first option fairly quickly at the moment.
I heard that rugby union's potentially sort of having a private equity-backed global domestic league or something like that, which would be interesting to watch. But I agree. If we're going to mirror something, it has to be our, dare I say, long-lost brother, rugby union, which means that you need at least 3 or 4 genuine domestic competitions, and then you can garner respect of being an international game. So I think rugby league's all in all heading in the right direction. It's good to see some love for international rugby league. It's come off the back of Volandis, Abdo and co. And the longer they stay in charge of the ARLC, I think the better international rugby league will be. Whether that's a good thing or a bad thing conceptually or ideologically, I'll let the listeners make up their own mind. But the reality is the IRL is broke. They facilitate, as we said, the export framework and government relationships, so the government can fund, partially the sport in those countries, etc. But from a balance sheet point of view, they've got no money. So hopefully this 10-team viable World Cup changes that, so we can achieve a viable 14 World Cup down the track and a viable Women's World Cup and Wheelchair World Cup. And I think we're heading in the right direction. So I think that seems like a good place to leave it.
One more thing, Keith, just to everyone listening though, right? Vote with your feet, right? Make the business case stack up. How do you do that? Get to the international games, watch them on TV.
Absolutely.
Buy a jersey, right? You do those things, and you make the bean counters happy, and at the same time, it then gives someone who's got a bit of vision a little bit more room to go and chase it. So if you like the international game, make an effort. Go to one less club game. Go to the international at the end of the year. You know, and you're doing a little bit there. Just think about that.
Yeah, well said. And the perfect place to leave it. So, Fonzie, thank you so much for coming on. And Stu, as always, thank you for coming on.
All good.
Cheers, lads. Been a pleasure.
Thanks for listening to Everything Rugby League. If you like this episode, give the show a follow and leave a review. For more news and insights, follow us on Facebook or head to everythingrugbyleague.com.